Hi folks, this is all the fruit, and today I want to tell you about the fruit, or rather the nut, which was, well, the big survival food of the city of Heidelberg for many centuries, but at the end it's directly brought upon the downfall and destruction of this city. Here we have a very fortunate moment in history in many different aspects. Very fortunate because it shows Heidelberg at the height of its power, and also fortunate because there was Marian, the first guy in the world who could actually etch a city on a copper plate in such almost photographic exactness. Although he applied a couple very subtle changes. The picture is almost photographic, but he's done some very subtle 17th century Photoshop on it, which you wouldn't notice if you were not really aware of that. Basically, you can look into the streets, the churches and the palace and the old bridge are slightly bigger than the private houses and so on. And also very fortunate because just a couple years later, just after Marian had left the city, the city was burned down, and Marian went to Frankfurt, which was not burned down in those wars, which was very fortunate for him. So why was a nut so incredibly important for Heidelberg, and why did this nut at the end led to the destruction of the city? Let's do everything very historically, because this is, despite the fact that most people come to Heidelberg to look at 17th century stuff, which is quite young for European standards, the history of this area is quite old. Let's just cover the important parts which are important for this nut and for fruit cultivation. So 3000 years ago here on the Heiligenberg there was a huge Celtic fortress / capital of a whole Celtic tribe. Well, did those Celts cultivate this important nut, and did it lead to their downfall? No, not really. I was fortunate enough to visit the Celtic garden in the Marburg Botanic Garden this summer, and it shows that the Celts, they cultivated some grains and some beans and some herbs and other plants where we are not so sure what they cultivated them for. But they didn't really cultivate fruit and nut trees as far as we know, except in southern parts where they were in contact with the Greeks of Massilia or with the Phoenicians or in early contact with the Romans. But basically, no, they did not cultivate this nut. Then later the Celts were destroyed by the Germans, and then the Germans were conquered by the Romans. And the Romans brought a lot of important plants here. Here, those slopes underneath the Celtic capital, they were most probably covered with some sort of agriculture back then. Single houses have been found here at the outskirts, well, remnants of single earth houses here at the outskirts of the capital. But probably not orchards in our modern sense. The Romans introduced orchards and introduced three very important trees, which we can see here. The fig tree, which never caught on so much in Germany until the end of the 20th century because of the cold climate. Second, the almond tree, which is almost extinct here in the area, replaced by the more ornamental peach almond. But actually, throughout the Middle Ages, the area around here was the main almond producing area in the Holy Roman Empire, and actually exported almonds throughout the Holy Roman Empire. So is this the important nut I'm talking about? I mean, the almonds have this seed which is basically called a nut, that they were very typical for here. No, neither the fig tree, not the almond tree is the one I want to talk about nowadays. The third important plant the Romans introduced is the chestnut. And there are still a couple really magnificent chestnuts here in the area of Heidelberg. Of course, nothing compared to chestnuts in the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean, the chestnut was one of the most important foodstuffs for thousands of years. Actually, in Mediterranean mountains, there was almost no grain cultivation, but they would get their starch from the chestnut, which is arguably much more tasty than boring wheat and barley starch. And the thickest tree in the world used to be a chestnut in Sicily. I think it was about 25 meters thick. The tree still exists, but the thick trunk has collapsed since then. Well, the Romans introduced the chestnuts here in the in the first millennium AD. Well, probably in the first century BC, but they need a couple decades to grow properly. And in parts of southwestern Germany, actually in the areas where the Romans introduced an even more important fruit plant, the grapevine, wherever the grapevine could grow, the Romans conquered in Germany. Wherever the grapevine could not grow, the Romans did not go. And whenever the grapevine could grow, also the chestnut could grow. So in the areas around the Rhine River and its tributaries, here we have the Neckar River going through Heidelberg, the chestnut became a very important foodstuff throughout the Middle Ages. And yeah, it was important for humans. If there was a surplus, which rarely happened in the Middle Ages, you could feed it to the pigs. And actually even nowadays the lower, milder forests around Heidelberg are so full of chestnuts that actually the pigs don't even care about acorns and other such forest nuts. Even in March, April, you can find tons of acorns lying everywhere in the forest, because all winter the wild boars, they eat just chestnuts. They don't care about the boring acorns. So can we find this so important nut here on the etching? This was, by the way, total high-tech for that time. I've seen pictures of Heidelberg and other cities just a generation before Marian, and it's basically like the change from black and white photography to smartphones, the change from medieval style pictures where you definitely couldn't see such details, and something like this that we can study almost like a photograph. And see, there is also a legend down here. Legend is the parts that you're supposed to read. Well, this is not the original legend, of course. It's not included here in the setching, but let's see what they say. Castle, Friedrichsbau, Dicker Turm, those are Zeughaus, Ballspielhaus, those are important parts of the castle, especially some which the ruling monarch back then had built, so you had to include them because they were his achievement. Big Fass building, this is the biggest barrel in the world, is here in Heidelberg. Over there in the castle, because Heidelberg was an important wine growing area for 2000 years. Then garden, the orange trees, another garden, another castle, a church, a monastery, a gate, a church, the chancellor's office, the princess coin, the house of the guilds, and so. Oh no, this is actually the revenue office. Do you notice something? First, they mention the castle and the important parts of the castle. Then they mention the garden and the fruit trees, the orange trees and the other garden. And only then they mention such unimportant things like the revenue, the city fortifications, the churches and monasteries. Well, if you know anything about civilizations, you know that fortifications and tax collection are among the most important things in civilization. And there was nothing more important than the church in medieval and early modern age Europe. Actually, Heidelberg during the religious wars, when all this was destroyed, was more or less the capital of the Protestant fraction. But before all the churches and revenue office and fortifications, there is the garden and the orange trees. Well, those orange trees were much, much smaller, but of course, because the cultivation of oranges north of the Alps in greenhouses was extreme high-tech for that period, they have grown and actually 3 or 4 times bigger. But it's also possible that they were quite big, because in Italy they could grow oranges of this size in greenhouses even in the Middle Ages. So gardens and fruit cultivation were extremely important, but they only mentioned the oranges because the prince was the only one who had the high tech and the money to cultivate them. Here you see vineyards and orchards and so on. Also here orchards, but they are not mentioned, they were not so important. Okay, so in the legend we cannot find anything about the very important nut, but we can find it in the picture. Look at that. When you have a fortified city and the capital city at that, and the castle, how do you fortify them? Yeah, you make a couple walls around them, and also you cut down all the forest around them so that you can see every approaching enemy. But look at that. Ain't that strange? A mature forest of huge trees right above the castle. Actually, they can fall on top of all those houses here. Look at those giant trees here, literally towering over the castle. They are still there. Well, not the same individuals because the forest was burned down and cut down too many times, but they are still there. Why were they here? This is a total weakness in the defense of the city. And yeah, they were here because they were crucial for feeding the people. There were a lot of wheat and other fields down here, but part of this area was sand dunes and part was swamps, and a lot of them were swamps half of the year and sandy flats the other half of the year. So, and the ones with the good irrigation and good soil were very heavy clay, so none of them were really good at producing a lot of corn, a lot of starch. So the city relied on those chestnut trees. Well into the second half of the 20th century, they were crucial for the survival of the people of Heidelberg. And so this forest was left right above the city where people could go up and collect them and bring them down. And unfortunately, not very long after this etching here was produced, an enemy army, I forgot if it was the French or the Catholics, actually snuck all the way through this forest and invaded the city and the castle and burned down Heidelberg. And that's why what you see here, some of the churches were left standing, although many of them were destroyed. That's why the houses you see here are not the same houses from here. Those are the medieval houses which were burned down. Oh, now there is a city guide now. Now I have to yell louder than this lady. So the houses you see here, they are not the same as the houses you see here. But if you see here, the plan of the city is exactly the same. It was rebuilt on the medieval plan, but with Baroque architecture. Okay, I'm sure I can yell louder than the lady, but let's move a little bit. The ground is covered with chestnut fruits. However, there is not a single chestnut seed, or what you would call the actual chestnut here. That's why the one thing everybody still forages here in Heidelberg are chestnuts. Actually, whenever new people, expats or students or tourists come to Heidelberg and are here in autumn, the initiation ritual here is to bring them to the forest to forage for chestnuts, because even most other Germans know the chestnuts only from the Christmas markets, but not from actual trees, because most of Germany, at least before the climate change, is historically too cold. That's why you see hundreds of those fruits here, but not a single seed, because every single one of them has been foraged. Look at this beautiful old chestnut here on top of the small kiosk. Over 1.5 meters thick, probably 150 to 200 years old. One of the oldest ones in Heidelberg. Another ancient chestnut tree. Look at this mighty tree. It's growing in the open. A lot of the chestnuts used to grow like this back in the time where they were important for food. Growing in the open in a pasture or in an orchard with smaller trees of different species. Look at this. It's almost 2 meters thick. I don't know a chestnut here in Heidelberg that's bigger than it. There is one about 100 kilometers away from here, clearly bigger, and yeah, in Italy and France and Britain they are much bigger ones, but for the Heidelberg area it doesn't get bigger than this. Here they have cut down a chestnut tree. Here it is, or maybe it was already, well, it was about to fall. It's hollow. That's a. Ich film nur den schönen hohlen Baum. Ich film nur den schönen hohlen Baum hier. Der hat so eine schöne Höhlung in der Mitte. Ja, ja, man sieht's. Der hätte es nicht mehr lang gemacht. Ja, richtig schön, wenn sie da irgendwas mit Vogelhäuschen oder für irgendwelche Kleintiere. Ja, ja, da braucht man nicht viel machen. Oben ein Dach, ein Boden und das Türchen ist auch schon drin. Ja, ja. Wie bitte? Ja, ja, genau. Wie gesagt, da macht man ein Dach und einen Boden und dann hat man's. Richtig schön. Yeah, so very typical for those chestnuts. They can grow to incredible age, but usually they get hollow. And this one fell over and had to be removed. And this is also the destiny of the thickest tree in the world, which was a chestnut in Sicily. Became hollow, and now you basically have a 20-meter ring of old 2 to 3 meter thick trees, which are basically the suckers of the old 20-meter thick stem. Yeah, most of the old chestnut groves were not single trees. Remember this old etching, this old picture of Heidelberg. There were big trees growing in a stand like a forest, just like those here. And this is one of the last remaining old chestnut groves in Heidelberg. The trees, probably the oldest ones, are under 100 years old, but you never know, because around here a lot of things grow slowly. Here are the medlars I'm taking care of, and actually I was almost afraid somebody is trying to take away my job, but they had to remove this chestnut tree while I have to remove the vegetation that competes with the medlars. But here you can see one such old chestnut grove, albeit abandoned for probably the last 50 to 60 years. The one behind the castle is still there and more majestic than this one, but I was too lazy to walk there today. But yeah, you see towering chestnuts. You can also use them for timber, of course, but the main use were the fruits, well, the nuts. A lot of the really old ones were removed here 15 years ago when we cleared the area for the medlars. And basically there would have been a couple more chestnut trees in such an area and not much other vegetation, because such areas were intended as chestnut groves. You cannot really mix the chestnut very well long term with fruit trees like apples, plums, pears, because the chestnut will outcompete them very quickly. I guess you can mix it with walnuts, which grow to similar sizes. I don't know of historic cases around here of chestnuts being mixed with walnuts. But yeah, this is more or less a not so bad example of such old chestnut groves. There are two maybe better looking ones I know around here in Heidelberg, 2 or 3, but I wanted to do the view of the castle, the old etching by Marian, and a nice chestnut grove in one trip. Tell me if you want me to make a video about the historic chestnut grove above the Heidelberg castle, folks. Apart from that, stay tuned for a lot more fruit videos from the beautiful and incredibly fruit-rich and nut-rich city of Heidelberg. And of course, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe.